The morning of December 19, 1944, somewhere in the frozen Ardennes Forest, Belgium, Technical Sergeant Werner Kleist crouched inside a camouflaged listening post, headphones pressed against his ears, his breath visible in the frigid air. For 3 days, since the German offensive had begun, his unit, a mobile intercept section of the Wehrmacht's General der Nachrichtenaufklärung, had been tracking American radio traffic with methodical precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They had monitored countless transmissions, coordinates, artillery requests, unit movements, all transmitted in clear, confident English over frequencies between 40 and 48 megahertz. And something puzzled Kleist deeply. The Americans never stopped talking. More troubling still, they never lost coordination. By late 1944, German signals intelligence had become remarkably sophisticated. The Wehrmacht's intercept service, operating from fixed stations across occupied Europe and mobile units following the front lines, had mastered the art of listening to enemy communications. From their listening post at Euskirchen, German operators monitored American traffic originating in the United States and Iceland. From stations scattered across France and the Low Countries, they tracked British and American tactical communications with precision that would have impressed even their enemies. The Germans had learned to distinguish American units from British ones by subtle differences in radio procedure. Americans used different operating signals. Their voices carried distinctive regional accents, Midwestern versus Southern, Boston versus Texas. German intelligence officers compiled glossaries of American military slang, studied idiomatic phrases, catalogued the rhythms and patterns of American radio discipline, or rather, the frequent lack of it. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, German intercept operators had grown accustomed to a predictable pattern in American communications. Infantry units at the company and battalion level used handheld radios called the SCR-300, transmitting on AM frequencies between 3.5 and 6 megahertz. These radios were notoriously unreliable. They leaked water during amphibious landings. Their batteries died after less than 24 hours of operation. Most critically, they used amplitude modulation on low frequencies, which meant German operators could hear nearly every word spoken by frontline American troops. The AM transmissions were vulnerable in ways the Americans perhaps did not fully comprehend. They could be jammed with simple noise generators. They could be spoofed. German operators had occasionally transmitted false orders in English, watching with satisfaction as confused American units obeyed. And most importantly, they revealed unit locations, operational plans, and tactical intentions with crystalline clarity. German intelligence officers wrote detailed reports about American unit movements based entirely on careless radio chatter, intercepted from SCR-300 operators who talked too much. But something had changed. Beginning with the American landings in Normandy and accelerating through the summer and fall of 1944, German intercept operators began hearing something new, a different kind of American voice traffic, clearer, more reliable, and far more numerous. The transmissions came from a new radio the Americans had deployed in massive numbers. Intelligence reports identified it as the SCR-300, a backpack-mounted transceiver operating on frequency-modulated signals between 40 and 48 megahertz. The technical specifications that German intelligence gathered about the SCR-300 should have been reassuring. It was heavy, 35 pounds with batteries. It had limited range, roughly 3 to 5 miles under optimal conditions. It required trained operators, though the Americans seemed to give them to ordinary infantrymen with minimal instruction. On paper, the SCR-300 looked like just another piece of American equipment, functional, mass-produced, but nothing revolutionary. Yet, German intercept operators like Sergeant Kleist were discovering something that the technical reports had not captured, something profound. The SCR-300 was changing the nature of American tactical coordination in ways that made the Wehrmacht's carefully developed intercept techniques suddenly, frustratingly ineffective. The SCR-300 used frequency modulation. This was not a minor technical difference. It was a fundamental shift in how radio signals propagated and how they resisted interference. Amplitude modulation, which the Germans and most military radios still relied upon, varied the strength of a radio signal to encode voice or data. AM was simple, well understood, and easily intercepted. It was also highly vulnerable to interference from atmospheric conditions, engine ignition noise, and deliberate jamming. Frequency modulation worked differently. Instead of varying signal strength, FM varied the frequency of the carrier wave itself within a narrow band. This seemingly subtle change produced remarkable results. FM signals were nearly immune to the kinds of interference that plagued AM. Static, atmospheric noise, and even deliberate jamming attempts produced minimal disruption. An FM receiver experiencing interference would simply ignore anything on a different frequency, locking onto the strongest signal, a phenomenon engineers called FM capture effect. The Americans had embraced frequency modulation for their tactical radios earlier than any other military force. The Galvin Manufacturing Company, better known by its trade name, Motorola, had received a contract from the War Department in 1940 to develop a portable FM radio for infantry units. The project engineering team, led by Daniel Noble, who conceived the FM design, and Henrik Magnuski, the principal RF engineer, created something unprecedented. By spring 1942, they had working prototypes. By June 1944, nearly 50,000 SCR-300 units had been manufactured and deployed across every theatre of war. The impact on American infantry coordination was immediate and dramatic. Battalion and company commanders finally possessed a dependable portable radio. Forward observers could call in artillery with precision. Infantry platoons advancing through hedgerows in Normandy, forests in the Ardennes, or jungles in the Pacific maintained constant contact with company headquarters several miles to the rear. The SCR-300 allowed American infantry to coordinate combined arms operations, infantry, armor, artillery, with a speed and flexibility that confounded German defensive planning. But there was something else, something the German intercept operators were only beginning to understand in December 1944. The SCR-300 wasn't just resistant to interference, it was resistant to interception itself. Not because the signals couldn't be heard, German receivers could pick up the transmissions easily enough, but because frequency modulation on VHF frequencies behaved differently than the AM signals German intelligence had spent years learning to exploit. FM signals on the SCR-300's 40 to 48 MHz band were line-of-sight transmissions. They didn't bounce off the ionosphere like lower-frequency AM signals. They didn't travel hundreds of miles at night when atmospheric conditions were favorable. They transmitted in relatively straight lines from antenna to antenna, limited by terrain and the curvature of the Earth. This meant German intercept stations positioned miles behind the front lines, optimized for monitoring long-range AM traffic, often couldn't hear tactical FM transmissions at all. When they could hear the signals, German operators discovered another frustrating reality. The Americans seemed to have learned radio discipline. Whether this was the result of training or simply the confidence that FM gave them, German intelligence officers noted a marked change. American operators using the SCR-300 transmitted briefly, used proper call signs, and followed procedures that made traffic analysis significantly more difficult. More troubling still was the sheer volume of transmissions. The Germans had grown accustomed to tracking a relatively small number of American radio nets, but the SCR-300 had been issued so widely to battalion headquarters companies, to forward observer teams, to tank infantry coordination units, to airborne operations that the American tactical radio network had become dense, overlapping, and difficult to map. German direction-finding units attempting to locate specific American headquarters by triangulating their radio signals found themselves overwhelmed by dozens or hundreds of simultaneous transmissions on similar frequencies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And then came the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Beginning before dawn on December 16, 1944, some 30 German divisions launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes Forest. The assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units were thinly spread across terrain. The Allied High Command had considered too rugged for a major German offensive. 2 American divisions were green, composed of troops who had never experienced combat. 2 others were exhausted from recent fighting, positioned in the Ardennes to rest and recover. The German attack plan depended on speed, surprise, and seizing American fuel depots during the advance. German tank units had been allocated nearly 5 million gallons of fuel, but logistical realities meant much of it would never reach the front. The panzer divisions needed to capture American supplies to sustain their drive toward the Meuse River and Antwerp. Everything depended on momentum, on shattering American defensive positions before reinforcements could arrive. On creating panic and confusion, the Germans achieved surprise. They shattered the initial American defensive line. They created a 45-mile bulge in the Allied front. But they did not create the confusion they had anticipated. Despite being caught off guard, despite taking heavy casualties in the opening hours, American units maintained coordination in ways that German commanders found inexplicable. Back in his listening post, Sergeant Kleist heard it happening in real time. American voices remained calm, professional, transmitting grid coordinates, requesting artillery support, reporting German positions. Units that should have been isolated and panicking were calling for reinforcements with precision. Forward observers, trapped in surrounded positions, were directing artillery fire onto German columns with devastating accuracy. Company commanders separated from battalion headquarters were coordinating withdrawal routes and establishing new defensive lines. The transmissions came through clearly, seemingly immune to the atmospheric interference that had plagued winter radio communications in previous campaigns. More frustratingly, Kleist's unit could not jam the American signals. The frequency-modulated transmissions ignored the AM-based jamming equipment the Wehrmacht had deployed. Attempts to broadcast noise on American frequencies produced no discernible effect. The Americans simply kept talking. On December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, Kleist's commanding officer reviewed the intercept logs with growing concern. They had identified American unit designations. They had tracked troop movements. They had pinpointed the headquarters locations with reasonable accuracy, but they could not disrupt American coordination. More troubling, the Americans were coordinating defensive operations faster than German intelligence could process the information their intercept units were gathering. Lieutenant Heinz Schreiber, the evaluation officer attached to Kleist's intercept company, wrote in his daily report, "American tactical communications exhibit unexpected resilience to interference. Their new portable radios operating on FM frequencies maintain coordination despite adverse conditions. Our jamming efforts produce minimal disruption. The enemy demonstrates improved radio discipline and maintains communication networks that rapidly adapt to tactical developments." Assessment: American infantry coordination significantly more effective than anticipated. The report was filed, forwarded up the intelligence chain, and ultimately made little difference to the outcome of the battle, but it represented a dawning realization that would reshape military communications for the rest of the war and beyond. The Americans had achieved something the Germans had not anticipated and could not easily counter: reliable, jam-resistant tactical coordination at the battalion and company level. The technological advantage was not dramatic. It was not the atomic bomb or radar or some secret wonder weapon. It was a 35-pound backpack radio using frequency modulation. But that apparently mundane piece of equipment had fundamentally altered the tactical balance. American infantry companies could coordinate with battalion headquarters. Forward observers could direct artillery onto German formations within minutes. Tank and infantry units could communicate directly, combining their capabilities with deadly effect. Isolated units could call for relief or organize coordinated breakouts from encirclement. And the Germans, despite possessing sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities, despite having spent years perfecting intercept techniques, despite understanding radio theory as well as anyone, could do almost nothing to prevent it. They could hear the American transmissions. They could plot unit locations. They could write intelligence reports, but they could not jam the signals effectively, could not spoof American operators with false transmissions, could not sow the kind of communications chaos that previous German offensives had relied upon. The irony was profound. German signals intelligence had become remarkably effective at monitoring Allied communications by late 1944. They had cracked codes, tracked unit movements, intercepted diplomatic messages, and provided Wehrmacht commanders with detailed intelligence about Allied intentions. The German radio intelligence organization, the General der Nachrichtenaufklärung, employed approximately 12,000 signals troops by the war's end, operating an elaborate network of intercept stations across Europe. German intercept companies in France monitored British and American radio traffic from the Atlantic coast to the English Channel. Fixed stations at Euskirchen and Bergen, Norway, tracked long-range American communications from the United States and Iceland. Mobile intercept units followed German armies on all fronts, providing tactical intelligence in near real time. The Germans had even established specialized units to intercept American non-Morse radio teletype traffic. This vast intelligence apparatus had provided German commanders with extraordinarily detailed information about Allied military operations. In North Africa, Rommel had relied heavily on radio intelligence to track British movements and anticipate Allied attacks. On the Eastern Front, German intercept units had achieved remarkable success in identifying Soviet unit deployments and operational plans. In the Mediterranean, German intelligence had monitored Allied communications to predict amphibious landing sites. But in the Ardennes in December 1944, all that sophisticated intelligence capability confronted a simple technological reality. The Americans were coordinating their tactical operations using a radio technology that German intercept and jamming equipment had not been optimized to counter, and that coordination advantage was proving decisive in ways that transcended the raw numbers of troops and tanks engaged in the battle. By December 25, 9 days into the offensive, the German advance had stalled. The 5th Panzer Army had penetrated to within 4 miles of the Meuse River, but could advance no farther. German tank units were running out of fuel. American reinforcements, including the 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed to defend Bastogne, had established defensive positions that German attacks could not overwhelm. More critically, improvements in weather allowed Allied air power to enter the battle with devastating effect. The German commanders who had conceived Operation Watch on the Rhine had anticipated that surprise and momentum would create confusion in American ranks. They had expected isolated American units to surrender or retreat in disorder. They had counted on capturing fuel depots before American forces could evacuate or destroy them. They had planned to reach the Meuse River within 3 days, and Antwerp within 4. None of those assumptions proved correct. American units, though surprised and often surrounded, maintained coordination and fought with determined resistance. Fuel depots were evacuated or burned before German forces could capture them. The pace of the German advance fell far behind schedule almost immediately, and throughout the battle, American tactical communications remained functional, allowing isolated units to coordinate, reinforcements to be directed efficiently, and defensive positions to be established faster than German intelligence had thought possible. Sergeant Werner Kleist remained at his listening post through Christmas Day, 1944. The intercepted American transmissions continued their relentless rhythm: artillery coordinates, status reports, requests for medical evacuation. The voices betrayed exhaustion, cold, and stress, but they maintained their procedural discipline. More importantly, they never lost the ability to coordinate. What Kleist and his fellow German intercept operators were witnessing represented a fundamental shift in military communications that would echo through the remaining months of World War II and reshape tactical doctrine for decades to come. But understanding why required looking beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Ardennes to the broader technological and doctrinal transformation that the SCR-300 embodied. The development of portable FM tactical radios by the American military had not been a sudden breakthrough, but rather the culmination of years of research and development that other nations had largely overlooked. Edwin Howard Armstrong, who had served as a major in the United States Army Signal Corps during World War I, had developed frequency modulation technology during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Armstrong understood something that would prove militarily significant. FM offered dramatic reductions in the effects of ignition noise and atmospheric interference that plagued amplitude modulation. The United States Army had recognized this potential earlier than other military forces. Prior to World War II, American signal officers had already begun developing tank, vehicular, and man-portable frequency-modulated radio transceivers. The SCR-300 for tanks, operating between 20 and 27.9 MHz. The SCR-608 for artillery, covering 27 to 38.9 MHz, and the SCR-300 for infantry, designed to operate between 40 and 48 MHz. This early adoption of FM technology reflected a distinctly American approach to military communications, where European military forces emphasized centralized control and relied heavily on wire communications supplemented by long-range radio. The American military doctrine increasingly emphasized decentralized execution and mobility. American commanders wanted subordinate units to operate with initiative, adapting to battlefield conditions rapidly. That required reliable communications at the company and battalion level, not just at division and corps headquarters. The technical advantages of the SCR-300 became apparent during field testing at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in spring 1942. The radio demonstrated its capacity to communicate through interference that would have rendered AM radios useless. Engine noise from nearby vehicles barely affected transmission quality. Atmospheric static that made AM communications difficult or impossible during certain weather conditions had minimal impact on FM signals. The rugged design survived rough handling that would have damaged more delicate equipment. Production began immediately. By 1943, SCR-300 units were seeing combat in the Pacific Theater, beginning in New Georgia in August. Colonel Ankenbrandt reported to General Meade that the radios were exactly what is needed for frontline communications in this theater. The main difficulty, he noted, was keeping them supplied with fresh batteries, the BA-70 or BA-80 batteries that powered the 18-tube transceiver, lasted approximately 15 hours under normal use. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the SCR-300 had become ubiquitous throughout American infantry, airborne, and armored units. The radios were issued not just to headquarters companies but to forward observer teams, reconnaissance units, and combined arms coordination teams. Battalion commanders could communicate with company commanders up to 5 miles away, assuming favorable terrain and proper antenna deployment. Company commanders could coordinate with platoon leaders. Forward observers accompanying infantry advances could direct artillery fire with precision that would have been impossible with less reliable communications. The impact on American tactical operations was transformative. During the breakout from Normandy in July and August 1944, rapid advances that might have outrun wire communications were sustained by radio coordination. Tank and infantry task forces operating independently maintained contact with higher headquarters. Artillery forward observers, embedded with advancing infantry companies, called in fire missions that destroyed German defensive positions and counterattacks. The mobility that characterized American operations in France during the summer of 1944 depended fundamentally on reliable tactical radio communications. German military intelligence recognized that American communications had improved, but they did not immediately grasp the full significance of the technological shift from AM to FM at the tactical level. German intercept operators noted increased radio traffic. They documented improved American radio discipline. They observed that American units seemed to maintain coordination even when wire communications were cut or when advancing rapidly. But the full implications that the Americans possessed a fundamental technological advantage in tactical communications that German jamming and intercept capabilities could not easily counter took longer to understand. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 provided the starkest demonstration of that advantage. The initial German artillery barrage that opened the offensive cut wire communications across much of the American front. Telephone lines that connected forward positions to battalion and regimental headquarters were destroyed in the first minutes of the attack. Under previous circumstances, this loss of wire communications would have isolated American units, forcing them to rely on runners, visual signals, or unreliable radio communications vulnerable to jamming and interference. Instead, American units throughout the Ardennes switched immediately to radio communications using the SCR-300. Company commanders reported the German attack to battalion headquarters. Forward observers, though often surrounded or cut off, continued directing artillery fire onto German columns. Isolated units coordinated withdrawal routes or established defensive positions while maintaining contact with friendly forces. The tactical communications network that German planners had expected to collapse under the shock of surprise attack remained functional and effective. The 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in the Ardennes only days before the German offensive, suffered catastrophic losses when 2 of its regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender on December 19th. Approximately 6,500 American soldiers were captured in one of the largest mass surrenders of United States troops during the war. But even this disaster demonstrated the impact of reliable communications. Other units of the 106th Division, though battered and pushed back, maintained coordination and fought delaying actions that disrupted German timetables. Radio operators, including men like Elliot Annable who became separated from their units, continued transmitting intelligence about German movements until they were overrun or escaped. The defense of Bastogne illustrated the advantage even more clearly. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the town when German forces threatened to overrun it, relied heavily on radio communications to coordinate its defense. Surrounded by German forces for days, the paratroopers maintained contact with headquarters outside the encirclement using SCR-300 radios and other equipment. Forward observers directed artillery fire from guns positioned miles away, breaking up German attacks before they could overwhelm American positions. Supply aircraft dropping ammunition and medical supplies received accurate information about drop zones and urgent needs. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the surrounded garrison, famously replied, "Nuts," when German officers demanded his surrender on December 22nd. That defiant response became legendary, but equally significant was the fact that McAuliffe and his staff knew throughout the siege that relief was coming, when it would likely arrive, and where German forces were concentrating for attacks. They knew because radio communications allowed them to coordinate with Patton's Third Army, advancing from the south, and with artillery units providing supporting fires. Surrounded units in previous conflicts had often surrendered not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they lacked information about the broader tactical situation. The defenders of Bastogne always knew their position in the larger battle. German commanders watching their offensive stall expressed frustration about American coordination that exceeded their expectations. Intelligence reports noted that isolated American units continued fighting effectively, despite being cut off. German intercept units continued monitoring American radio traffic, plotting unit positions, but found they could not disrupt the communications network effectively. The jamming equipment the Wehrmacht had deployed for years, designed primarily to interfere with AM radio transmissions, produced minimal effect against FM signals. Attempts to broadcast false orders in English, a tactic that had occasionally succeeded against American forces using AM radios, failed because American operators using the SCR-300 had been trained in proper authentication procedures, and because the FM capture effect meant receivers locked onto the strongest legitimate signal rather than weaker spoofed transmissions. By early January 1945, the German offensive had clearly failed. The Allies eliminated the bulge in their lines by mid-January. The Wehrmacht had suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties and lost enormous quantities of armor and equipment they could not replace. The Ardennes offensive had been Hitler's last gamble to change the course of the war in the West. Its failure ensured that Allied armies would cross the Rhine and drive into Germany itself within months. The role of American tactical communications in defeating the offensive was rarely highlighted in post-war histories, which tended to focus on heroic stands by surrounded units. Patton's relief of Bastogne, or the eventual overwhelming material superiority of Allied forces. But military signals officers and intelligence analysts on both sides understood what had happened. The Americans had maintained tactical coordination under conditions that should have produced chaos. That coordination advantage had allowed isolated units to fight effectively, reinforcements to be directed efficiently, and defensive positions to be established faster than German commanders had anticipated. After the war, captured German intelligence documents revealed the extent to which Wehrmacht signals units had monitored Allied communications throughout the conflict. Lieutenant General Albert Praun, who commanded German Army signals intelligence operations, wrote in a post-war report, "Until the summer of 1942, no difficulties were encountered in intercepting American radio communications, with the result that internet relationships could be easily ascertained. Even after the subsequent coordination of British and American operation procedures, there were still many characteristics which made it easy to distinguish the units of each army." But Praun's report also acknowledged the changing nature of American communications in 1944 and 45. The increased use of FM radios at the tactical level, combined with improved American radio discipline, had reduced the intelligence value of intercepts. More significantly, German ability to jam or disrupt American tactical communications had declined markedly. The report did not explicitly state that the SCR-300 and similar FM radios had provided Americans with a decisive advantage, but the implications were clear to anyone who read carefully. For the American military, the SCR-300 became validated equipment that would remain in service well into the 1950s. The lessons learned about the importance of reliable, jam-resistant tactical communications would shape the development of military radios for decades. The transition from AM to FM at the tactical level, which the United States had pioneered, would be adopted by military forces worldwide in the post-war period. The principle that decentralized operations required reliable communications at lower echelons became fundamental to American military doctrine. The technical specifications of the SCR-300 were not classified. Anyone could read the War Department Technical Manual TM11 242 that described the radio in detail, but the tactical implications of deploying 50,000 such radios throughout infantry, airborne, and armored units proved more significant than the Germans had anticipated. It was not the existence of the technology that mattered, but rather its systematic integration into American tactical operations. German forces had possessed frequency modulation technology as well. The Luftwaffe used FM for some aircraft communications. German tanks employed FM radios for close-range coordination, but the Wehrmacht had not recognized the tactical advantage of issuing FM radios widely to infantry units at the battalion and company level. German infantry communications continued to rely primarily on wire lines supplemented by AM radios that were vulnerable to the very jamming and interference techniques German forces sometimes employed themselves. This represented a broader pattern in military technology during World War II. Decisive advantages often came not from possessing unique technologies that enemies lacked entirely, but from recognizing the tactical applications of technologies and deploying them systematically. The Germans had radar, but the British integrated it into a comprehensive air defense system. The British had tanks, but the Germans developed combined arms tactics that used armor more effectively. The Americans had reliable tactical radios, and they distributed them widely enough to transform infantry coordination. Sergeant Werner Kleist survived the war. In post-war interviews with Allied intelligence officers, he described his experience monitoring American communications during the Ardennes offensive. He recalled the frustration of hearing American units coordinate defensive operations, while his intercept company could do little to disrupt those communications. He noted that German soldiers in his unit had begun calling the American backpack radios Army Sprechfunk, American talking radio, and had come to respect their effectiveness. The technical manual for the SCR-300 listed its specifications matter-of-factly: 18 tubes, battery-operated, frequency range 40 to 48 MHz, approximate range 3 to 5 miles, weight 35 pounds with batteries. Simple numbers that described a piece of equipment. But those specifications translated into battlefield capabilities that reshaped tactical operations. An American rifle company commander in the Ardennes could talk to his battalion commander 5 miles away, regardless of weather, atmospheric conditions, or German jamming attempts. That capability alone was worth dozens of tanks or hundreds of artillery shells in specific tactical situations. The SCR-300 also represented something about American industrial and engineering approaches to warfare. It was not elegant or minimalist. British and German military radios often emphasized compact design and efficiency. The SCR-300 was large, heavy, and used 18 vacuum tubes where more elegant designs might have used fewer. But it worked reliably under field conditions. It could be operated by ordinary soldiers after brief training. It was mass-produced in quantities that ensured every battalion headquarters company and forward observer team could have one. American engineering prioritized reliability and abundance over elegance. This philosophy extended beyond radios to much of American military equipment. The M4 Sherman tank was inferior in armor and firepower to German Panthers and Tigers, but American factories produced tens of thousands of Shermans, while German production numbered in the hundreds. American field artillery was not dramatically superior to German guns, but American artillery doctrine emphasized rapid-fire coordination and ammunition abundance that overwhelmed German positions. The SCR-300 fit this pattern, good enough to work reliably, produced in sufficient quantities to equip everyone who needed one, integrated into tactical doctrine that exploited its capabilities. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the role of tactical communications in American military success had become apparent to signals officers and military planners, even if it remained less celebrated than tanks, aircraft, and infantry heroics. The United States Army had waged a mobile, decentralized form of warfare that depended fundamentally on reliable coordination between dispersed units. That coordination required communications that could not be easily jammed, that worked in all weather conditions, that could be operated by soldiers under stress in combat conditions. The SCR-300 and the FM technology it represented had provided that capability. It had not won battles single-handedly, no piece of communications equipment could, but it had enabled American tactical operations to function as intended. It had allowed isolated units to fight effectively instead of surrendering. It had permitted rapid advances without losing coordination. It had frustrated German attempts to disrupt American operations through signals intelligence and jamming. The Germans had intercepted American SCR-300 signals throughout the war. They had monitored the frequencies, documented the procedures, tracked unit movements based on radio traffic analysis. Their intercept operators were skilled, their equipment was sophisticated, their intelligence analysis was thorough, but they had realized, slowly and too late, that hearing American transmissions was not the same as disrupting American coordination. The technological advantage of frequency modulation over amplitude modulation at tactical ranges proved more significant than German intelligence officers had anticipated when they first encountered the new American radios. This realization came in stages throughout 1944. In Normandy, German forces noticed improved American coordination during the breakout from the beachhead. During the rapid advance across France, Wehrmacht commanders reported that American units maintained communications despite advancing faster than wire lines could be laid. In the Ardennes in December, surrounded German listening posts heard American forces coordinate defensive operations that should have been impossible for isolated, surprised units. After the war, military historians analyzing the European campaign would identify multiple factors that contributed to Allied victory: air superiority, industrial production, manpower advantages, superior logistics, strategic bombing of German industry and infrastructure. Each factor played a role, but buried in technical reports and signals, intelligence assessments was another factor that received less attention. The Americans had fundamentally better tactical communications than their opponents, and that advantage had enabled a form of mobile, decentralized warfare that German forces could not effectively counter. The story of the SCR-300 was not dramatic in the way that stories of fighter aces or tank battles or infantry assaults were dramatic. It was a story about engineers developing more effective radio technology, about industrial capacity producing equipment in large quantities, about tactical doctrine that integrated new capabilities effectively. It was a story about German intercept operators hearing American transmissions clearly, but being unable to disrupt them, about Wehrmacht commanders frustrated by American coordination they could not break. Most of all, it was a story about how technological advantages in warfare often come not from wonder weapons or dramatic breakthroughs, but from systematic application of better solutions to fundamental problems. The fundamental problem facing infantry in modern warfare was coordination, maintaining contact between dispersed units, directing supporting fires, adapting to rapidly changing tactical situations. The SCR-300 solved that problem more effectively than any previous tactical radio, and that solution, multiplied across thousands of American units in every theater of war, proved decisive in ways that are easily overlooked when focusing on more dramatic aspects of combat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.